Today I'll be building the Boardsource 3x4, which is a 12-key Macropad with a minimal look and has optional hot swap compatibility. I also purchased a custom stacked acrylic case in the color Wisteria from SM Keyboards. The case features I chose include a frosted finish, plate foam, and a clear component window for the top. It also has purple hardware and a 3mm acrylic plate with the SM Keyboards logo shown on the bottom. The package also came with a bag containing rubber feet and some extra accessories. From Boardsource, I ordered the white 3x4 kit, which includes the plate and backplate with the PCB, but I'll only need the PCB since I have a case. It came with a clear acrylic cover, standoffs, and rubber feet that I won't be using. However, I will be using the Elite C4 microcontroller, diodes, and the MX hot swap sockets. To start, I put down my rose pink American Haptics work mat and organize all the parts in the compartments above. I also grab my PCB and the hot swap sockets. I open up the strip and put them into a container for easy access. I use my fine tip tweezers from Stationery Stash and place each hot swap socket into the designated areas on the back of the PCB. I made sure to match up each solder point to the solder pads and paid extra attention to the orientation because I didn't want to install any upside down. You can easily tell what the correct orientation is because placing them the wrong way will block the large hole in the center that your switch is supposed to go into. Now that all the hot swap sockets are seated correctly, I moved over to another workstation in a room with better ventilation for soldering. I'll also be putting on my respirator and safety goggles for the process. I began to solder the hot swap sockets on, which need to be secured onto the solder pad on both sides. As suggested in the Boardsource build guide for the 3x4, I added just a tad bit extra solder to secure the hot swap sockets, giving it some extra strength. I'll be installing a lot of switches on this Macropad over time for photos, and that's a lot of pressure being put onto the PCB and sockets. The hot swap sockets are nice and secure, so the next step will be to add diodes. I prepared the diodes by grabbing some popsicle sticks and using them to create a tool to help me bend all the diodes the exact width needed for this PCB. I just grabbed the strip and wrapped it around the side of it, creating evenly bent corners. I only bent 12 since that's the number needed for this project. Then I pulled each diode out one at a time and inserted them into the PCB. It's nice that this PCB has indicators printed on it to help you know which direction the diodes will need to face. The black ribbon on them will need to be orientated towards the bottom. At this point, I was really excited about this part of the project, and that led me to adding all the diodes at the same time on accident prior to any soldering. I completely meant to add only a few at a time, then solder, before adding only a few again, but I ended up just going with it. Despite this error, I made sure to bend all the legs on the bottom to create tension so that it was easier for the diode to stay in place while soldering. I also turned the PCB over from time to time to double check my work. Once the diodes were all secured and good to go, I grabbed my precision snips to cut off the excess legs from the diodes. Here's how everything looks so far, but there's still some more soldering to do. I grabbed the Elite C microcontroller and took everything out of the bag. I went ahead and flashed my key map onto it, and for this project, I went with the default number pad on QMK. Next, I'll need to add the legs. I only need the two long sections, so I put the short one away. I put the legs in with the shorter side going up into the microcontroller, and then I gently placed it onto the work mat, keeping the legs at a 90-degree angle compared to the PCB. I soldered a few points in place to stabilize it, then I soldered the rest of it. The legs are good to go, so it's time to install the microcontroller on the PCB. This PCB features a zipper style connection that's pretty cool because it lets you friction fit the microcontroller in without the need for soldering. This also means it's essentially a hot swap. I gently applied pressure while inserting the microcontroller and it was done. The last step for the microcontroller is to trim off a little bit of length on the legs to help give it room when sitting in the case. I used my hand to cover it up while snipping it so that it wouldn't fly out into the room, but I had to put on a glove to reduce the feeling of it hitting my hand so hard. I actually realized later on in the build that I didn't really need to do this step since the case was pretty roomy, but if I had used the default backplate, it would have been an issue keeping them long. All the soldering is now finished, so I'll be returning to my main build workspace. At this point, adding rubber feet would be a good idea. I grab my Wow Stick precision screwdriver and open up the case to grab my plate and add the switches. For this build, I'll be using JWK Durock linear switches again, which were sent to me as part of a Switch Modders bundle from 1UP Keyboards. You can find a link to the bundle in the description down below. When grabbing the plate, I also went ahead and pulled out the plate foam. I went ahead and put away the rest of the case for now. Paying attention to the orientation of the PCB hot swap sockets, I place all 12 of my switches into the plate. Then I turn the plate over and place it onto the table. I layered on the foam, then grabbed the PCB and place it upside down onto the stack very carefully so that no pins are bent. I firmly pushed everything into place and now it's ready to be put back into the case. I reassembled the case and secured it with the screws. It's now ready for me to add keycaps. Something to keep in mind with this build is that the PCB is literally being held in place by all of the switches without anything under it to support it. This means that if you remove all the switches, the PCB will fall back into the case and you'll have to open it back up to reassemble it with switches. When changing out switches with this Macropad, I replace each switch a few at a time with the next switch so that the PCB is always secure. For keycaps, I'm going to start with 3 succulent Artisans sent to me from Capsmiths. Next, I grab my DSA Dark Magic Girl Specialty Key Set sent to me from the Key.Dot Company. You can save 5% on this key set as well as other Magic Girl variations from this collection by using my code MOCHI on the Key.Dot Company's website. I only needed the 1 through 9 keys since the PCB is key mapped as a number pad. This Macropad is now finished. The case and keycap combo is absolutely adorable and I love how small and pretty this build looks. Much of the aesthetic is due to the beautiful case design and color, and it matches perfectly with my Dark Magic Girl build with the KBD67 light. The Artisans from Capsmiths also look really nice against the frosted acrylic. My thoughts on the build process for this Macropad is that it's a lot easier than it looks. With all the parts laid out in front of you at the beginning, it does seem a little intimidating, but it was a pretty simple process and it was a really fun project to work on. My main reason for building this particular Macropad wasn't really for the functions, but for the purpose of being able to use it as a display pad for photos of keycap sets and Artisans. Adding hot swap sockets makes this such an ideal device for that reason, because I was easily able to change out my switches and keycaps twice when shooting photos of different looks for this Macropad. As I mentioned earlier, I did have to change out the switches only a few at a time in order to keep the PCB in place, but with so few keys involved, it didn't take much time at all. I also really love that I went with the clear acrylic cover at the top because it adds such a unique look to this Macropad with having the components displayed, showing all the hard work that went into the device. My total time for working on this build from start to finish was about an hour and a half, with most of the time being spent on the soldering portion and assembling the microcontroller. As for this being a good starter project for a beginner, I do think it would be best to go into this if you have some soldering experience already, since some of the diodes and the microcontroller were a little tedious to work with. If you're curious about this Macropad, you can check it out by visiting the link in the description below. It's such a great little DIY project and it makes me want to get into other Boardsource projects in the future. If you liked this build or found it helpful, please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more keyboard and Macropad builds. I have more keyboard builds coming up this month as well as another overview, so make sure to follow me on social media as well if you want to stay in the loop. Hope you've all had a great week and thanks for watching!